Let's dive into an idea that might sound completely wrong at first. We're told almost every day that the world is a dangerous, violent place. But what if the data tells a completely different story? What if, over the long arc of history, we've actually become far, far less violent? I mean, think about it. You turn on the news, you scroll through your phone, and it's just a constant stream of conflict, crime, and tragedy. It's so easy to feel like we're living in the most dangerous period ever. But is that feeling based on reality, or is it just a trick of our perception? Well, according to the psychologist Steven Pinker, our perception is, to put it mildly, way off. This quote really gets to the heart of his argument. He says we're suffering from a kind of historical amnesia. We forget just how brutal the past really was. To get a clear picture of today, we have to take a hard look back in time. And trust me, it's not the quaint, simple world we sometimes imagine. So, how do we get from that brutal past to where we are now? It wasn't an accident. Pinker's work shows these massive, long-term shifts where humanity slowly but surely began to rein itself in, and the first big one happened right at the dawn of civilization. Before we had states or governments, the day-to-day reality for most people was just constant danger. Just imagine it. Archaeologists have found that in these pre-state societies, the chance of dying a violent death from a raid, a feud, or a murder was sky high. The baseline for human life was, for a very, very long time, absolutely terrifying. So what was the first game changer? Pinker calls it the Pacification Process. As the first governments formed, they did something radical. They basically said, okay, nobody gets to use violence except for us. This central authority, what the philosopher Hobbes called the Leviathan, created a monopoly on force. It was a simple deal. You give up your right to get personal revenge, and in return, the state will protect you and handle justice. And just like that, the endless cycle of raids and feuds began to dramatically decline. And that was really just the beginning. On top of that foundation, we see three more huge shifts away from violence. You have the Civilizing Process, which was all about how individuals learn to behave. Then came the Humanitarian Revolution, which started to attack cruelty itself. And finally, something that happened in our lifetime, the Long Peace. Let's look at the data for that Civilizing Process. This chart is just stunning. It shows the Civilizing Process in action. Just look at that huge bar on the left. In 13th century England, your odds of being murdered were off the charts. Now, look at how tiny those other bars are. By the 20th century, the homicide rate had dropped by over 95%. That's not a small dip. It's a revolutionary change in how safe everyday life became, and it was driven by things like the rise of governments, commerce, and simple self-control. So, as people got better at not killing each other one-on-one, a new idea started to spread during the Enlightenment. People began to question not just personal violence, but cruelty that was baked into the system. Things that were considered totally normal for centuries, like public torture, witch burnings, and slavery. Well, suddenly people started seeing them as barbaric. This Humanitarian Revolution was all about the power of reason and a radical new concept, empathy. All right, I know what you're probably thinking. What about the 20th century? 2 world wars, the Holocaust? How does any of that fit into a story about declining violence? And that's fair, but this is where the story gets really interesting and maybe even more surprising. Look, there is no denying that the first half of the 20th century was an absolutely horrific spike in violence. But here's the key. It was a spike in a much, much longer downward trend. The real story of our modern era isn't the wars themselves, but what happened after 1945. The world was just exhausted by war, and it stumbled into a period of peace that was unlike anything in history. So what's the single most important number to understand this new era? It's right here. 0. That's it. Since 1945, the major powers of the world, the US, Russia, China, the UK, France, have not fought a single direct war against each other, not one. Historians call it the Long Peace, and it's a total anomaly. It had never happened before. And the good news doesn't stop with the big wars. In just the last few decades, we've seen this trend continue in so many other areas. There are documented, measurable declines in everything from civil wars and genocides to hate crimes to domestic violence and even violence against children and gay people. Pinker calls these the new peace and the rights revolutions, and it's all about our circle of empathy just getting wider and wider. Okay, so the evidence is pretty clear that violence has in fact been declining for a long, long time. That's the what. But the billion-dollar question is, why? What forces have been pushing us for centuries in this more peaceful direction? I mean, it's not like our basic human nature has changed, right? That capacity for violence, what Pinker calls our inner demons, that's still there. It's part of who we are. So the real puzzle is what has been empowering the other side of our nature? What's been propping up our better angels? Pinker pictures it like this constant tug of war inside us. On one side, you have our inner demons, those primal urges for things like revenge or dominance or using violence to get what we want. But on the other side, you've got our better angels, things like empathy, self-control, and our ability to reason. The whole story of human progress, he argues, is really the story of figuring out how to tip the scales in favor of those better angels. So what are these big forces that tip the scales? Pinker boils it down to 5 key things. First, the Leviathan, that strong government that makes violence a bad bet for individuals. Second, gentle commerce, the simple idea that when we trade with people, they become more valuable to us alive than dead. Third is feminization. As women's influence in society has grown, societies have become less violent. Fourth, the expanding circle. Things like reading books and living in diverse cities help us empathize with people who aren't like us. And finally, the escalator of reason. As we get better at abstract thinking, we can step back and realize how pointless and self-defeating so much violence really is. These 5 things, working together, are the engines that have been driving peace. So, where does all this leave us? The point of understanding this incredible, surprising decline isn't just to be optimistic for the sake of it. It's about recognizing the specific things that have made our world safer. And that leaves us with a huge question. Are these trends permanent? Is this progress irreversible? Or is it something fragile that we have to actively protect to make sure we keep those better angels in charge?